Thank you very much for inviting me. Also, most important, thanks for organizing this conference. I was able to attend this morning now that Thanksgiving is behind me, and I've been really impressed by what I've seen. It's really a wonderful project. So today, in the next 45 minutes, which is what I believe I have, I will be talking about the work of one of the most important social psychologists of the 20th century, Stanley Milgram, who was born in 1933 and who died in 1984. So Milgram, as most of you probably know, is known for many contributions to social psychology. He was the inventor of small world experiments. Indeed, we owe him the notion of degree of separation and the folk idea that we're all connected by 6 degrees of separation. He did some crucial work on altruism with the lost letter experiment. And he was ranked as one of the most influential psychologists. He's definitely one of the most cited psychologists of the 20th century. Today, however, I will be focusing on a small part, but the most well-known part of his work, namely his obedience experiments. I suppose most of you are familiar with Milgram's work on obedience, but later on in this lecture, I'll be describing his work in more detail. The first paper was published in 1963 when Milgram was 30 years old and an assistant professor, a lecturer, I believe, actually at Yale University. And much of the work was described in the 1974 book, Obedience to Authority, where Milgram reported 18 studies of obedience, which is part of a 24 set of studies that Milgram conducted between 1961 and 1963. He also made a movie in 1965 called Obedience. Now, this work, as you probably know, is extremely influential. It's one of the most well-known contributions of psychology to scholarship. It's part of any textbook in psychology. So what you see here on the left part of your screen is a very well-known textbook by Schachter, Gilbert, and Wegener. And in some part of the book, there's a detailed discussion of Milgram's experiments, and what you see on the bottom part of the page. It's also usually discussed together with Zimbardo's famous and also controversial prison experiments that we see on the top of the page. There's many books actually dedicated to Milgram's work and to the obedience experiments in particular. I gave you 2 books here by Blass, which is a wonderful book, and by Flint. But what's important to know also, if you don't know it, is that Milgram's work on obedience has in fact reached way beyond the domain of academic psychology. It's been used in other disciplines to understand many social phenomena. Most important, Christopher Browning, in his very important work on the Second World War and on the genocide of Jews in Germany and Eastern Europe. Browning has used Milgram's work to try to understand why ordinary people, ordinary German, ordinary Polish people, ordinary French people in France could have contributed to the German genocide of European Jews. And which is, of course, totally meaningful, because if you know a little bit of Milgram's work, you know that Milgram's work was very much influenced by his thought and experience with genocide. He himself was Jewish, and some of his family had died, and some had survived from the European genocide. And it's not simply the academic world that was very much influenced by Milgram. In fact, Milgram's work reached way beyond academia. He was denounced in a play in the 1970s. And Peter Gabriel, that you see him, he even wrote a song about Milgram's work called "We Do What We Are Told to Do." So it's a very important work, both in academia and in the broader culture. But from the beginning, it has been extremely controversial. So the the paper, as I mentioned earlier, was published in 1963, and what was not very usual at the time, it was immediately discussed in the broader media. The New York Times discussed it in 1963, and following the New York Times many articles, most famously, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch wrote an extremely critical discussion of Milgram's work, calling it an open-eyed torture. And Milgram published a response in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. In academia, the work was extremely controversial, mostly for ethical reasons. Diana Baumrind published in 1964 this paper here that you can see, Some Thoughts on Ethics of Research, after reading Milgram's behavioral study of obedience in the American Psychologist, which is the official journal of the American Psychological Association. And Milgram wrote a response to Baumrind's paper. Diana Baumrind provided an extremely critical discussion of the ethical aspects of Milgram's work, and the exchange between Baumrind and Milgram is widely believed to have been one of the factors, not the only one obviously, but one of the factors that led to the decade of work in the APA to redefine the norms of ethical research on human subjects and the formulation of the ethics code by the APA in the 1970s. Now, today we're going to be focusing on a renewed controversy about Milgram's work that's inspired by the book published in 2012 by Gina Perry called Behind the Shock Machine. So that book was extremely influential. In that book, Perry, who is both a journalist and a psychologist, really pushes forward three main objections against Milgram's obedience experiments. The first one is that she renews the ethical objection against Milgram's work, arguing that Milgram's work was unethical because it caused harm to participants and deceived them with respect to the point of the experiment. The second one is that in contrast to the way Milgram describes his own experiment, one of the assistants of Milgram, namely the one who played the psychologist in the experiment, was intensely coaxing participants. He was pushing participants to pretend harm the other participants, the learner. And the claim here is that Milgram misdescribed really what was happening in this experiment. And the third one, which is the one we're going to be focusing on today, is the incredulity hypothesis, not incredibility, it's incredulity hypothesis. So what is this hypothesis? Well, the claim is that Milgram experiments do not show that people can be led to hurt others. Why is that? Because in fact, the participants in Milgram experiments did not believe at all the experimental setting. They did not believe that they were harming someone else. They did not believe that they were giving electric shock to someone else. And that's extremely reassuring. Milgram's experiment has been interpreted as painting a very bleak picture of human beings. If Perry is right, we can actually remain committed to a much more glowing and a sunny picture of what human beings are like. However, what I will be arguing is that Perry's picture is actually quite mistaken. In fact, her main objection, the incredulity hypothesis, is mistaken. There's really no evidence that it's largely mistaken, not fully mistaken, but largely mistaken. There is no evidence that we can dismiss Milgram's study based on the idea that the participants to Milgram's study did not believe that they were shocking a real individual. And Milgram's experiments, as I will be arguing, still provide us with evidence for the phenomenon of destructive obedience. Namely, that a surprisingly large percentage of us, you, me, ordinary human people, under minimal coercive demand, are willing to cause harm to other people, to hurt other people, even when we are fully aware that causing harm goes against our own moral commitments. So that's what I will be arguing in the remainder of this talk. So what I will do is I will tell you a bit more about the obedience experiment, then I will tell you a bit more about the incredulity hypothesis. I will argue that it's a mistake to identify Milgram's work with what we could call junk social psychology in light of the replication crisis. I will point out a tension in Perry's hypothesis between her ethical criticism and the incredulity hypothesis, and then we will be focusing on the core of Perry's hypothesis, looking more closely at the data. All right, so let's remind you first of the obedience experiment, or I should say obedience experiments. I will start with the 1963 study that was reported in the 1963 paper, the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology. That study was first piloted in 1960, at the end of 1960, fall 1960, with 12 Yale undergraduates that were taking Milgram's Psychology of Small Group course. So Milgram had a course, and he wanted his undergraduates at Yale to get used to do some experiments involving a one-way mirror. And he piloted that experiment with 20 of them. The pilot was extremely successful. That led him to do this larger experiment that was conducted at Yale in 1961. To do so, he recruited 40 male participants. They were all adults between 20 and 50 year old. They were not undergraduates. They were all recruited from the broader community in New Haven, where Yale is located. The paper that resulted was first submitted to the Journal of Personality, an important journal, but that was quickly rejected. I think it was not even sent for review. It was then submitted to the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology in 1961. It was first rejected, but surprisingly, it was then accepted, which is, we all wish that happened to us, for some curious reason. The paper was accepted in 1962 after having been rejected in 1961. It's Milgram's first publication. He had just obtained his PhD in 1960. As we've seen earlier, that paper made a huge splash. And if you've read these 8 pages, you can see why they're written to be extremely catchy. So the paper, as I mentioned, was extremely controversial immediately, but nonetheless, it won the AAAS Prize for Behavioral Science Research in 1964. And it was part of an NSF-funded project. It was the first study of an NSF-funded project that Milgram completed between 1961 and 1963 that involved 24 studies, 18 of which are in the 1974 book. And that's the first of a series of publication that leads to the 1974 book. So let me remind you of the study. In the study, participants are brought to a lab. The first study, it's a 1963 study, a lab at Yale in New Haven. And there they meet 2 people. One of them is going to be the learner, and that's the person who is seated there. The one on the right, on the left of the learner on the screen is a participant. The one on the right is a psychologist, or an assistant psychologist. Both the learner, the one seated, and the assistant psychologist, wearing a lab coat, are confederates. They're not real participants. They're confederates. The learner is pretending to be a participant, just like the real participant on the left. So when the participants come to the lab, he meets the learner, and they pretend and they draw randomly who is going to be the learner and who is going to be the teacher. In fact, the draw is a trick. The participant is always the teacher. Then they bring both the teacher and the learner to a room in study 1, in the 1963 study, and they tie the learner, so the confederate here that you can see, to a chair, and they put to him some electric wires. That's what you can see here on the screen. Then they go back to the other room. That's what you see on the second picture on the right of your screen, which is in front of a one-way mirror. in this room, the teacher, so the participant, is sitting on the chair in front of a box. And what you see on the box is 30 different switches that the teacher is going to be pushing if he wants, if the participant is going to be pushing if he wants. The experiment has the following pretense. The participant has been told that the learner will have to learn the association between two words, for example, dog and sky, cat and table. And then the learner is going to be tested. When the learner makes a mistake, the teacher will have to give him an electric shock in order to see whether punishment improves the learner's capacity to retain the association between words. Now, of course, all of that is a setup. None of that is real. The learner is not really shocked. What the participant sees are mistakes of the learner, and the participant has to decide whether or not to electrically shock. The participant has to decide whether or not to electrically shock the teacher, who is, of course, a confederate of the psychologist. And to shock the learner, the participant has to push the switch that you see on the box. So as I said, there are 30 switches from 15 volts to 450 volts, increasing by a degree of 15 volts. Each of these switches are marked by a label, so by group by 4. It starts by mild, it goes to XXX for 450, and it increases like that. The participant has to decide, whenever there's a mistake, the participant has to decide whether to shock the learner. If the participant hesitates, the mock assistant that you've seen on the first picture is supposed to give him 4 prompts that insist that the participant must shock the learner in order for the learner to know. And that's what you see on the left picture, on the last picture on the bottom of your screen, where participants is decided whether or not to shock the learner, and the mock psychologist is inviting, using one of the 4 prompts, the participants to shock the learner. Here are the results of the 1963 experiments, and what you see here are the 30 degrees of shock, from slice shock to XXX, from 435 to 450. In that experiment, the learner does not give any feedback, does not protest until 300 volt is reached. At 300 volt, the learner knocks on the window, the participant has to decide whether to shock. After 300 degrees, the learner does not do anything until 450. Now, what you see here on the screen is before 300 volt, all participants decided to shock the learner. At 350, 5 of the 4 participants decided to stop the experiment, despite the prompts of the mock assistant. Between 350 and 365, 8 more of them decided to stop. All the other ones, the 26 other ones, went to 450 shocks. It's only the first experiment. If you look at the other experiments, so 65% of participants decided to go until the maximum degree or the maximum intensity of shock. They're called to be obedient. All the other ones are said to be defiant. You find very similar results if you look at the other experiments that are reported in the 1974 book, and I've just given you here the first study. The studies vary from one another depending on various details, such as whether or not the learner gives some voice feedback, experiment 2, whether the learner and the teacher are seated near one another, experiment 3, and so on and so forth. So Milgram did many variations in this experiment. And this variation lead to changes in the proportion of participants who are willing to give the maximum degree of voltage to the learner. But in all of the cases, there's at the very least a very large minority, and in most studies, a majority of participants are obedient, meaning they're willing to give as much harm, pain as they can. It's surprising, and in fact, when you ask people how many participants would give the maximum intensity to the learner, psychiatrists, college students, and middle-class students say that no one would actually give that much intensity to the participant. That's what you see on the last slide. It's important also to see that Milgram made many pictures, made the movies, and if you look at people being part of the experiment, it's very obvious that they look very distressed. So what you see here is a still from the movie that was made by Milgram, and it's very clear that the participant seems quite distressed by the experiment. In fact, Milgram measured the experiment and asked people after the experiment to report the degree of how tense they were, and as you can see, many participants report being either moderately tense, and a large proportion of participants, the second mode is that people are extremely tense and nervous. There's a debate about what the explanation is for these results in Milgram's sequence of studies. I will not be focusing too much on that, first for the sake of time, since I see I'm already running a little bit late, and also because really what's at stake here is not so much the explanation of the phenomenon, but the reality of the phenomenon itself, the reality of the idea that people are in fact under minimal coercion willing to harm others. So I will set aside for the sake of time the explanations, and I will be focusing on the reality of the phenomenon in the rest of this lecture. So I hope the presentation was clear, but so it's a little bit rushed. Let me just now focus on the incredulity hypothesis that was put forward by Perry. So Perry's main idea is that most participants, in fact, did not believe at all that they were harming anyone. And because they did not believe at all that they were harming anyone, it's not very surprising that they were willing to play along the psychologies and impose a maximum voltage to participants. She supports this claim in many ways. She looked at the questionnaires that Milgram sent to all participants in the summer of 1962. And in this questionnaire, it's clear that some participants report that they did not believe they were harming people. For example, subject 408 said, "I found it hard to believe that Yale would allow a paid subject to absorb such punishment." Or subject 502 says, "His refusal convinced me that he was an experimenter or an unshocked participant." She also looked at some of the data that were unpublished, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. And her conclusion is that, in fact, Milgram's experiment shows the opposite to what we've been taking it to show. It shows that when, in fact, people are believing that that they are shocking a participant, they're reluctant to harm. It's only when they are not believing, when they fail to believe they're shocking a participant, that they're actually willing to harm someone. And that she has also defended a very similar idea in a paper published in 2020, more recently. It's important to note that her concern is not new. The idea that participants in Milgram's experiment did not really believe the setting of the experiment has been already widely discussed in the 1960s and 70s. So she's really redeveloping an old explanation of Milgram's findings. Horner and Holland in a 1968 paper, in a paper in the National Journal of Psychiatry, discussed this point. The philosopher Stephen Patton discussed it also in 1977 in two papers. But what's surprising is that most people concluded that this experiment was unlikely to be true. But Perry nonetheless tried to give some new life to this objection, in part because she got access to the archives of Milgram that were opened in the late 2000s and early 2010s. And she was able to use these archives to breathe a new life to the incredulity hypothesis. All right, so before looking at the incredulity hypothesis, I want to just make a small aside that is somewhat inspired by social media, in particular by what used to be called Twitter and is now called X. So in recent years, it has become quite common to identify Milgram's work, as well as other classic work from the 1960s and 70s, with a type of work in social psychology that fails to replicate. And the idea is Milgram's work, Milgram's obedience experiment, is as bad as the type of work that we've seen in the last decade of psychology to be unreplicable. I think it's important to realize that this assimilation is deeply mistaken. It's deeply mistaken on 3 grounds. So the first one is that there's a very clear contrast between, on the one hand, the type of social psychology that fails to replicate and Milgram's obedience experiment. So what you see on top of the screen is a messy desk. Why a messy desk? Well, because there is this famous paper by Vos in the 2008, I believe, where Vos made the hypothesis that working on a messy desk makes you more creative. And she did this experiment, reported some positive results showing there's a correlation between working on a messy desk and being more creative, and publishes that paper. Lo and behold, this hypothesis, this finding failed to replicate. So what's characteristic of Vos experiment and many social psychological experiments that fail to replicate is that it tests some really weird hypotheses, some hypotheses whose prior probability are unlikely to be true. That's not the case at all of Milgram's obedience experiment. Milgram's obedience experiment is on its face valid. It somehow ties to a phenomenon that we are all quite familiar with. And what I gave you here on the left, the bottom left of your screen is a very famous picture of obedience to authority. It's a German meeting here, a Nazi meeting in Germany in 1936, where nearly all Germans but one, August Messer, that you can see here circled, grant salute Hitler with the usual Nazi salute. So obedience to authorities that Milgram was tested is in fact face valid. It's not an improbable hypothesis. It's something that's quite commonsensical. What's surprising in Milgram's experiment is not so much obedience to authority, is that the fact that people are willing to go to the maximum degree of obedience with minimal prompting. So that we can't really, so the type of hypotheses that are tested are not at all the same kind of hypotheses that are tested in contemporary psychology. What you see on the right part of the screen, it's also something really puzzling about the incredulity hypothesis, right? If it's really the case that people are not believing in the hypothesis, as the incredulity hypothesis seems to be suggesting, it's unclear why they are behaving the way they are behaving. The simplest hypothesis is indeed that people are believing in the hypothesis and nonetheless are harming other people. So that's one contrast between recent social psychology and Milgram's hypothesis. Recent social psychology tests unlikely hypotheses, one of the reasons why it fails to replicate. Milgram's hypothesis tests something that's on its face value. Another one is that it's very clear that much of the issues, or part of the issues with recent psychology, is due to p-hacking. So social psychology, p-hacking is a phenomenon where people, in many ways, manipulate data analysis, often unintentionally, in order to increase the probability to get a positive result. If you know a bit of Milgram's work, you know that in 1963 there is no p-value of the work. And in fact, you know that most of the work does not really rely on any inferential statistics. What's really striking here is just a proportion of people that can be led to harm other people with minimal prompting. Now, I'm not telling there is no questionable research practices work in Milgram's work. There are indeed questionable research practices, but they are not P hacking. There was really no effort here to move P below the significance level. And last and most important, Milgram's work is in fact easily replicable. So here is a literature review that I've done with my co-author on this project. In many studies, you find very similar type of results that have been reported by Milgram. So the work, in contrast to recent work in social psychology, is in fact easily replicable. So the conclusion is that it's a mistake to assimilate Milgram's work with a type of work in recent social psychology that fails to replicate. Milgram's work just isn't this type of social psychology. It might be bad work for some reason, but not because it's P-hacked work or very implausible hypothesis and unreplicable work. So why is it wrong then, if it should not be assimilated with junk social psychology? Well, one reason why it is wrong is because it's ethically problematic. And there is no doubt that that in some respect, Milgram's work was ethically dubious. Here is how Perry described her experience when she made the shot machine, the box I showed you earlier. She described it as, she said that for many of the subjects, it was an instrument of torture. And indeed, I've shown you this picture and the self-report of participants. It's clear that at least some of the participants were extremely stressed by the study. So I think there's indeed, the study raised interesting and complicated ethical questions, more complicated than it's usually admitted. But for purposes, what really matters is that there's a tension in Perry's criticism of Milgram's work between two ideas. On the one hand, the ethical objection, which is the idea that participants were harmed by taking part in Milgram's experiment, and the other one is that participants did not believe that they were harming someone. On its face, you can't have it both. If people did not believe that they were harming anyone, if people were merely pretending, playing along the psychologists because they were part of the experiment, they wanted to be done, then they were not tortured, then they were not stressed, and so they were not harmed at all, right? So you can't really have it both ways, right? You can't criticize Milgram for harming participants and deceiving them with respect to part of the experiment, and arguing that people were only pretending to be harming someone. So there's a tension here in Perry's experiment that she's not fully aware of, and that is somewhat undermining the whole cogency of her book. At least the ethical objection as that, I should say that I do agree that there are very serious ethical concerns with Milgram's work. But I don't believe that you can have both the ethical objection and the incredulity hypothesis together. Now, let's really focus on the incredulity objection itself. And let's look at what the data really show, because that's the core of Perry's criticism of Milgram's work. So what you see here is a report that Milgram sent to all the participants to the 24 studies that he conducted between 1961 and 1963. So the reports were sent, and because Milgram himself was concerned about whether or not participants were engaged to the right degree in the study. And so participants were given a questionnaire, a 5-point questionnaire, from 1, I fully believe the learner was getting painfully shocked, to 5, I was certain the learner was not getting the shocks. And participants had to answer this questionnaire. And then he tabulated their answer as a function whether they were defiant, meaning they stopped before 450, or obedient. They went until 450. And that's really the main aspect, the main component of Perry's critical discussion of Milgram's work. Now, the first thing to say is that what we're dealing with is retrospective self-reports. And whatever it is that people say in this self-report, we should take it with a grain of salt. We know that retrospective self-reports aren't fully trustworthy. People are mistaken about what they had done, particularly 2 years before fulling the survey. So we should take what they say with a grain of salt. What's more, here it's really important to realize that we are asking people to explain their behavior that is in some way ethically problematic. So you're asking people who decided to give a 450 volt shock to a participant why they decided to shock someone. And I think it's not unreasonable to believe that those who say they did not believe they were shocking someone did so because they are ashamed of their behavior. They want to rationalize their behavior. They want to justify the behavior they had 2 years before the survey. So it's actually quite problematic to take Perry's self-report, to take participant self-report at face value as Perry does. But we can bracket that question and take a look at the self-report themselves. So the first thing Perry does is look at the number here that you see circled on the screen. And she notices that of the 800 plus participants that took part to all the experiments that Milgram conducted, only 21% of those were both credulous, namely they fully believed that the learner was getting painful shocks, and were obedient. Right? And so she concludes from that really it's really a tiny minority of people who just are in fact believing they're harming people, and when they're believing, they are willing to go to 450-degree voltage. So that's her first take on the matter. But really, this is not quite the right way to think about the issue. The right way to think about the issue is to look at the proportion of subjects who either believed that the learner was getting painful shock, which is 56% of all the subjects, or were thinking that the learner was probably getting the shocks, which is 24% additional of the subjects. So when you aggregate, 80% of the subjects were either fully believing or where they were thinking that there was probably someone that was getting shocked. And why is that the right way to think about the numbers? Because of the moral dimension. If you believe that it's probable that someone is getting shocked, probably you should not go until 450 volt shock. Even if you believe there's a small chance that someone is getting shocked, it's still very problematic to be willing to shock anyone. So the right dimension is 80 or even maybe 86% of participants who say either that they fully believe, they believe that it was probably the case, they probably that it was likely to be the case, and see how many of those were in fact willing to shock the learner to the maximum degree possible. And you can do that easily. That's what we do in the papers I'm actually describing. So when you analyze the data, that's what we do here for all the 800 plus participants. What you see here on the y-axis is degree of credulity. One says fully believed, 5 says not believed at all. What you see on the left column are people who were obedient. They shocked to 450 volts. What you see on the right is people who were defiant. So the result is that there is a small negative correlation between being skeptical and being so between being credulous and being defiant. So what it means that people who the more credulous you were, so the more likely you were to believe that you were really shocking someone, the more likely you were to stop before 450. So what it shows here is what it does show is that there is a grain of truth in the incredulity hypothesis. It is true that people who were believing they were really harming someone were more likely to stop, or put it the other way around. People who were believing they were not harming anyone, the more you were believing you were not harming anyone, the more willing you were to go along. So that's a degree of truth, that's a grain of truth in the hypothesis. But it's important to see that the effect size, as you can see on the graph, is just really small. There is a correlation, but it's a tiny effect size. Most people, whether or not they, most people, when they believe, whether or not they believe that they are harming anyone, are willing to hurt the learner. What's more, Machery et al. Also look at the same data, the data I've just analyzed for you on the previous slide, but the analysis is problematic in many ways. So they do two different models in the 2020 paper. The first one involves dichotomizing the scale I gave you. So they put together 1 and 2, they drop 3, and they put together 4 and 5. Now, there's a lot of things to say about dichotomization, about p-hacking, and when they do that, that's what you see on table 4, they get the effect that the odds ratio is significant. So people who did not believe were significantly more likely to be obedient compared to people who did not believe it, who did not believe. And the odds ratio is 200.5. In the second model, they take the 5 scales that they treat as ordinal degree. And what you can see is that there's an odd ratio that people who were maximally credulous were more likely to be defiant. They were more likely to stop between 450. So they're looking at the same data I just showed you, and they fit 2 different ordinal regression models to it. And their conclusion, that you can see here in text, are the following one. That's an odd ratio, that's for the first model of 2.5, suggesting that those who had a high level of belief that the shocks were real were 200.57 times more likely to be defiant than those who had a low level, and they say it was a substantive effect. With the second model that uses a 5 scale, they said it increased by 3.7 times, and they say it's strongly affected, and they talk of dramatic variation. Now, that's extremely problematic. The first one is that it confuses 2 things that should not be confused. It confuses odds ratio and relative risk. So what you get in the models are an odd ratio. And what you see, so you see below on the bottom of your screen, you see the definition of an odds ratio. It's a ratio of 2 ratios. And what you see on the right part of your screen is a relative risk. A relative risk is a proportion of defiant people among credulous divided by the proportion of defiant people among skeptical people. So what they describe in the text is actually a relative risk. So when they say that those who had a high level of belief that the shocks were real were 257 times more likely to be defiant than those who had a low level belief, what they are describing there is a relative risk. But the data that are reported in the table are not a relative risk. They're an odd ratio. And it's really important not to confuse the two, because a relative risk of 257 is a huge relative risk. An odd ratio of 257 is not that big an odd ratio. And they're in their report, they're confusing the 2 of them. They're also misinterpreting effect size. Remember the odd ratios that they're reporting as 257 and 300 and 3.7. Now, if you know a little bit about odds ratio, you know they're extremely hard to interpret, extremely problematic as a way to convey information about effect sizes. So I wanted to help you see a little bit what that means. So here are some mock numbers. Let's suppose that among credulous people, 66% of them were defiant. Among skeptical people, 50% of them were defiant. So difference is 16, which is not a huge difference, right? This means people who are credulous were slightly more likely to stop before 450. The odds ratio is, however, equal to 2. The relative risk is equal to 1.3. Let's suppose that among credulous people, 60% of them were actually willing to go to 450 volts. Among skeptical people, among credulous people, 60 people were unwilling to go among 450. Among skeptical people, only 40% were unwilling to go up to 450 volts. Now it's a small. Here's the absolute difference is only 20. It's a large or maybe medium difference. The odds ratio is now equal to 3, and the relative risk is equal to 1.5. I think what you should see here is that even for differences that are actually not particularly large, you actually get an odd ratio that's equal to 3. So I think it's a mistake here to do what Perry and colleagues are doing, to call an odds ratio of 2.5 or 3 very large or substantial, when it corresponds in fact to a relatively moderate absolute difference. So moving on to another type of data, Perry also uses an archival analysis by Hollander and Turozet that suggests that many people after the experiment, in the debriefing experiment, said that they did not believe that they were harming the learner. It's a very interesting study. However, Perry and colleagues misunderstand the point of participants' reports. When participants report they were not harming people, it's because they distinguish harming and hurting. In fact, during the whole experiment, participants are told that while the learner is getting shocked, the learner won't suffer permanent harm. The learner won't be harmed. And what you see here is the distinction between injuring someone and hurting someone. So it's a misunderstanding of what the participants are really reporting. It's not that the participants do not believe that they're hurting or shocking someone real. They're just believing, as they are in fact told, that the shocks won't cause any harm. And the last point about the data is that scale that Milgram had participants complete. It's also a post hoc share. It's also a scale that was sent after all the studies were completed. It's a 1 to 14 scale, 14 being the maximum, that reports the degree of pain that, according to them, the victim, the learner, really felt. And as you can see, in all the experiment, both the obedient and defiant participants report a belief that the learner was getting quite a painful shock. In fact, near the maximum of the scale. The conclusion here is that the data, when you look at them correctly, fail to support the idea that participants were incredulous. It is true that there is a small effect of credulity. Participants that were skeptical of the experiment were slightly more likely to be defiant. They were slightly more likely to stop before 400 voltage. But this effect is very small, and most participants, when they report they were either certain or likely, or they believe it was likely there was a participant, a large proportion of those were actually willing to shock. So what we have here is that, no doubt, Milgram's work is not beyond ethical, and I've already talked a bit about that, in methodological criticisms. There's many reasons. It's not the type of psychology we would do. in the 2020s. There's many reasons to be concerned with that type of work. But the incredulity objection does in fact very little to undermine the usual interpretation of Milgram surveillance studies. Milgram surveillance studies do show, in fact, that with minimal prompting, a large proportion of people are willing to set aside their moral commitments and to harm others, as Milgram argued at length in his work. So to conclude, I'd like to thank my co-authors on this project. On the way, John Duris at Cornell as well, who is a philosopher that most of you probably know, and Laura Nimi, a psychologist also at Cornell. And thank you for your attention.